much, Bertrand, for dragging me out here. And I don't think I really will even attempt to answer that question. I hope that's okay. But thank you for having me at this event. And it's nice to speak at events where I feel like I can kind of speak my native language as a reporter and not, I killed my PowerPoint presentation at the last minute, which you sort of feel like you have to do at these conferences, but it was never something that felt natural. It's also really an honor to follow Marty Baron, whose speech I watched this morning, and the rebirth of the Washington Post under his leadership is really one of the great positive stories of media now, certainly of American media now, and it's just sort of a fantastic thing. BuzzFeed News comes out of a slightly different tradition than the Washington Post, to put it mildly. We were born out of web culture. We reach a larger share of millennials with hard news than our traditional competitors, but are also kind of coming into our own as a news organization. And we're new to this in some ways. I think at our core, what we have sought to do is to fuse the culture and the language of the web with the values and the forms of the web with the values of kind of traditional adversarial reporting. But I think, like what Marty was saying earlier, we also feel very energized by the deep engagement with news right now, something, I mean, more deeper than anything I've ever felt in my career, and feel a sense of mission at this very complicated moment in American and global journalism. I think I'm going to talk a bit about how BuzzFeed wound up in the news business and where we are as a global news organization, more than 250 reporters around the world. Our great Brazil editor, Graciliano Rocha, here, and I think Daisuke Furuta, who runs BuzzFeed Japan, is here. And you know, we compete on stories from Washington and Silicon Valley to London and Sao Paulo and Tokyo. And I think I'd also like to talk a little about how we think of one of the core challenges for all of us, although in some ways especially for BuzzFeed, which is how do you get people to trust you? And we'll just conclude with a question that was raised in a post column about our decision to publish the now famous Trump dossier, which was whether we are or should be engaging in something called journalistic populism. But just in terms of like how BuzzFeed, how the world's most famous cat site wound up in the news business. I spent most of my career as a political reporter in New York, and then in Washington for Politico. And I think if you were a political reporter in the United States in 2008 to 2012, I had a blog at the beginning. You guys may remember these things called this antiquated technology called blogging. If in 2008 to 2010, these blogs felt like the center of the universe, if you were writing one of them and breaking news on that part of the internet, you could just feel the energy leave it and move over to Twitter in particular. And by 2011, I think I and a lot of other reporters saw one of the real satisfactions of the job as breaking news, doing big stories, and seeing them get shared on social media, and that felt where like the real active conversation was. And so when Jonah Peretti, the founder of BuzzFeed, approached me to take this fairly traditional political reporting skills over to a website that was known and had grown big for funny animal videos, lists, essentially the kind of building blocks of web culture, it did not initially make sense to me. But I think what I kind of came to understand was that what BuzzFeed was then was really a laboratory for figuring out what people would share on platforms like Facebook, and was imagining an audience that when they, at that point, opened up their desktop computer, now your phone, they don't go to your website, they go to Facebook, they go to Twitter, they back then went to StumbleUpon, now they go to Snapchat, and that the challenge if you're making media is not so much how do I build a complete bundle, a complete destination that will bring people to me, but how do I make individual pieces of content that will punch through on those social platforms? And BuzzFeed was thinking about that, in terms of what would be funny, what would be emotional, what would people share on Facebook. I was thinking about it, I think as a lot of reporters do, much less abstractly. How can I break some news that gets 1 million retweets? but in the same way was thinking about about the social conversation, not about sort of building a destination. And so we started with political reporting and took that model to other areas where, really in particular, the legacy media had pulled back. We hired foreign correspondents, investigative reporters, places where we felt we could really cut through, a big bureau in Silicon Valley covering tech. And I think we had initially a sort of ideological belief in social, and in fact totally neglected our homepage, neglected our apps, and then as we built a news operation that got most of its scale from social, started to realize that people would come to our homepage to say, oh, I've seen all this news from BuzzFeed, what's happening now? And we weren't doing anything. The homepage was just like lists of cats. And so we built a breaking news organization sort of at the latter part of that growth to serve that need. And in particular to serve a need for an audience. I think that this is different from some publications, but we definitely view our audience as people who are swimming in social media, who are seeing, when news breaks, who are immediately seeing what's happening, are immediately seeing a bunch of false claims, are seeing unverified rumors, are seeing all sorts of things, and that our role is certainly to report out what happened, but also to very aggressively debunk and steer people through that complicated ecosystem. And that brings me to a question that I've certainly wrestled with since I got to BuzzFeed, which is trust. You know, we started with this huge advantage of a brand that people really loved, but it would have been a weird question in 2012 to say, do you trust BuzzFeed? Like, no, you go there to be entertained. And I'm a political journalist, and certainly like the first kind of reporting we did was to try to get scoops and break news about American presidential politics, which are high stakes and competitive, and when you succeed on those beats, buy you a sort of seat at the high table of journalism, you know, because it's just so competitive. But I think, and I think this is true to varying degrees in different markets, but certainly in the United States, it's not really a place where you win trust because the waters are so poisoned. People use political stories to club each other with, not to, you know, build community around. And so we think about really two other paths in terms of how we do build trust. One of them is we've invested a lot in investigations that don't have to do with politics. We published this year a huge expose of the largest psychiatric hospital, bless you, of the largest psychiatric hospital chain in the United States that was essentially tricking people into being institutionalized, and making enormous amounts off their insurance. And this is stories that, you know, tens or hundreds of thousands of readers are touched by these institutions. They're not politicized. Nobody's yelling fake news at you. I think that's true. We've spent a lot of energy investigating student loans, educational institutions, sexual abuse on campus, things that touch our readers and touch real people, and are in a way apart from these sort of abstract, politicized conversations. And we've tried to do that globally. We published a huge series this week that I hope people will check out if they haven't, about the British government's very deliberate turning a blind eye toward a series of what the U.S. intelligence and others believe were Russian assassinations in Britain. And we found a huge appetite for that. But as I said before, we also see our role not just as delivering new news, but as helping our audience navigate the ecosystem. And I think we were among the first to start publishing as something that I think is a very valuable format, you know, at the top of a story, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's something that's false that you might have seen. Again, that's I think partly how we see our role in the ecosystem. It would be crazy for France 24 or for the BBC to say to its television audience, here is a crazy rumor you might have heard. Here's a crazy rumor that you haven't heard. Let us repeat it to you for the purposes of debunking it. But I think we certainly see our audience very hungry for that because they are seeing all this stuff. And they are seeing, by the way, something that anybody who's been in a newsroom knows, which is that when news breaks, none of us know what the hell is going on. We don't know any better than our audience. And those first messy few hours when you're trying to sort out, you know, who are the victims and who's the criminal and what exactly happened, and that's all playing out. It used to play out inside the newsroom, and then at the end of the day, you could produce a reasonably clean news article. Now that plays out in public. The audience sees what idiots we basically are, and we have to sort of reckon with the fact that our process is exposed. And we also get to see this increasingly, I think, professionalized network of people who are making up news around breaking stories and non-breaking stories, whether it's for political or financial motivation. And I think for us, we were very deeply engaged, really for a few years now, in figuring out around breaking news how false stories spread, and have seen that as part of our mission from the start. And I think that's probably why our reporter, Craig Silverman, was among the first to kind of document what he sort of coined. He helped popularize the term fake news before it got thrown back in all of our faces, and was the first to really understand the scale and the motives and the mechanisms for how, for instance, a bunch of teenagers over in Macedonia are making what's decent money for Macedonia, publishing sort of preposterous false stories about Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton that in some sense fulfill the wishes of consumers on Facebook. And I think that's a story that I know there's a lot of conversation around media literacy, and I certainly think that's it's important that that's like a class that is taught in my son's school in Brooklyn, and that I know Facebook is investing a lot of money in media literacy programs in that abstract sense. But I also think ultimately it's much more on us to report aggressively on the media ecosystem that is part of the news story, that's no longer separate and apart from what's actually happening. The media ecosystem is very much part of how news consumers are experiencing the stories. Often now when you talk to witnesses, as our team in London was on the scene of a terrorist attack outside a mosque, half an hour later, they're both telling you what they've seen and telling you what they've seen on Twitter and what they've heard on Twitter, and how the BBC has already screwed up the coverage, or whatever it is they think is just very deeply interwoven with the actual story. And I think that's something where it's much less an abstract project to be outsourced to universities and platforms, that I think understandably want to sort of find a way to, and I'm not sure penance is the right word, but to work on problems that are partly of their making. But it's also just very much a journalistic challenge to engage with the false news that's out there, with the process of news. And that brings me to my last point, which is that this sense of our role in the ecosystem touches on what this Washington Post columnist, and I think this was meant negatively, described as journalistic populism. And he was talking about our decision to publish, with clear context, an unverified dossier of claims about Donald Trump and his circle and their contacts with Russia. And this was a document that was being passed around at the highest level of American government, and not just being read by people like the president-elect, but also being acted on by very senior figures. And journalists, in fact, had been already repeating some of the claims from the document, but not making clear to their audiences exactly what those claims were and where they were coming from. And I think that when we felt that basically everyone on the inside, all the politicians, the journalists, the intelligence officials, the government officials, were aware of this document, and basically everyone was in on this except the audience, we definitely, I think that's where we saw our role a bit differently from a lot of our other outlets. And we don't see our role as ultimately kind of protecting people from complicated, unverified claims, or as serving as gatekeepers, but as sharing this historically important document and the context around it. And we think that's sort of what we can do. And I think populism is notoriously hard word to define, and not a word people are particularly particularly comfortable with these days. But I do think that at a moment of really historic doubt in institutions, we shouldn't expect people to trust us because we're keeping secrets from them. And they should trust us for the opposite reason, because we're sharing what we know and not confusing professionalism, which is really important to keep the sense that journalism is a profession with a set of standards, but to not confuse that with any kind of sense that we're a journalistic priesthood with access to mysteries that are beyond the audience's reach. And I understand the nostalgia and identify with the nostalgia for a moment when powerful media outlets did really control the gates and the distribution of information. But we certainly don't see ourselves as gatekeepers, and I don't think that's a realistic role to play, even if you do historically see yourselves that way. And instead, we see ourselves really as sort of the allies and guides for our audience through this very confusing, unstable time, and also incredibly exciting time to be a reporter. So thank you for letting me share these thoughts, and I look forward to taking your questions. I think they're... You had to clap, Graciliano. We have some mics floating around.
Ben, Peter Bale from the Global Editors Network. First, if you haven't read the British BuzzFeed section on the, I think, a dozen Russians, 14 assassinated inside the UK, which the British police are ignoring. I don't understand. In fact, I'd like you to answer, Ben. I've got a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind us. Why that hasn't been picked up, in your view, more actively by the rest of the British press? Is it just because they'd rather not do it with BuzzFeed? Also, you've done previous joint ventures with the Beeb on stories like that. I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't had more currency. Also, and again, it's a slight comment, the Steele dossier which you published, I think you will be vindicated in the end by that, because every day another drip comes out that shows that it was absolutely spot on. But the Reuters Institute people showed a chart of respect for news and admiration of news brands, BBC being very high on credibility, Guardian oddly quite low on credibility but high on comment, and BuzzFeed was just a tiny little droplet around entertainment. Does that worry you, that you are still in this difficult area of being seen as a serious news brand rather than just entertainment?
I guess I'll take the first part first. I mean, I think, we certainly... The BBC has, in fact, I did actually pick up the Russia stories. I mean, if you were in perhaps my position, sitting on some like really, really explosive allegations and trying to find the moment in the British news cycle over the last few months when you could drop them in, I mean, you guys are going to have another election. It's it's impossible. I think that they've actually been getting a fair amount of attention among the small sliver of attention left between elections and terrorist attacks over there at the moment. I think the question of we certainly think a lot about how you sort of build a news brand, as you said, in a global sense. I mean, a lot, I think, from a reporter's perspective, what matters is, do your subjects take you seriously? Are you getting your calls returned? When you publish a story about an institution, does the government come and shut down the institution? I mean, they're these very concrete questions that aren't really captured in public opinion research, and we are very confident about where that is. And I think on the sort of on the bigger question of like, how do you build a brand that somebody recognizes to the degree they recognize Reuters or the BBC or the New York Times? I mean, I don't really think it's like a marketing exercise. I mean, these are great institutions that have been around for decades or centuries and have, gradually won people's trust by doing stories that really matter to them. And I think that's sort of what we see it as. It's something, to some degree, story by story. And thank you for having me, by the way, Peter. Anything else?
Is that working? I'd be interested how your readers, users, read the Christopher Steele dossier. Did you get a sense that they had a reasonably sophisticated understanding of what was going on there? Or did they just love it because it was wild and out there?
I think there was a really wide range. And with a story like that, it's not sort of our readers, it is everyone. I mean, I think broadly that people, I got a lot of feedback that was, thank you for publishing this. I'm a teacher or a lawyer, and I don't see why government officials should be allowed to read this, and I can't. Like, it's not going to scald my eyes out. I'm capable of reading a document and understanding that it's unverified. And in fact, sort of how long were they planning to sit on it? So I think, I think that was the core of the feedback, just a sense that like, what do you think that we're not capable of dealing with ambiguity? I think people basically believe that they are. I do think that in the broader Russia story, of which this is part, particularly in the United States right now, there's a pretty large appetite for almost anything negative about Donald Trump, anything that feeds a conspiracy. We had a story the other week about this, a prominent British import for former MP Louise Mensch, who has at this point, I think at the point we wrote the story, accused like 200 some people of being Russian agents. You know, she had, and on, in most cases, no evidence. And there's a huge following for that, and actually it's really deeply muddies the waters. And I think there's also, it's a big temptation for journalists because there's traffic there, and I think we've fought pretty hard to resist that temptation. Different outlets, to varying degrees, are pushing really, you know, unsupported conspiracy theories. You know, which isn't to say there aren't real conspiracies and great stories to be done around Trump and Russia, which there are.
Hi.
Hands
Is this working?
back there.
Yeah. Sorry to step away from the journalism, but what advice do you have for legacy media about making money in the digital space?
You know, I kind of hesitate to advise legacy media. I feel like glib new media people are always coming along and treating legacy media people like if only they, you know, understood social distribution a little better, they would figure it all out. I think these transitions are like incredibly hard and in some cases impossible, and it's not so much the place of people who have the kind of incredible luxury of not dealing with factories printing up giant books every night or the huge apparatus that comes with broadcast to sort of tell, you know, to tell people how to do their business. I think the gap between the economics of legacy media, just the cost of producing it, and the cost of producing an hour of television versus the cost of getting a really compelling video out on social media is really, really wide, and that's a real challenge.
Hi, I'm Lucy Thomas with Outback Media.
I can't see you. Oh, there you
Over
are.
here.
Hi.
Hello. So my question is to do with whether or not you are concerned with internet surveillance tightening, especially in the UK in the light of the terrorist attacks, so on and so forth. So how concerned are you about this? And also, are you adapting your investigative practices with a source protection, something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody, journalists and not, ought to be concerned about certainly, you know, both government surveillance and and hacking and incompetence and all the different ways that people's hitherto private information gets out, right? I mean, I think, and there are, you know, we use Signal a lot. Wicker is a great tool. There are a lot of great tools that can sort of try to protect your privacy, and it's certainly something that we do think about a lot and try to use encryption, just because I think, you know, not so much even, you know, because you're worried about one thing or the other, but just because the systems are, like, it's just become so clear over the last few years how many different threats there are.
Ben, thank you for the presentation. Dimitri from BBC World Service. My question is about international markets and the trend where we see the big media companies going into vernacular editions, and so we see Huffington Post and you and us obviously, and New York Times beefing up Spanish. So given the huge demographic growth in those markets, what comes into your mind when you think about your strategy in international markets or markets other than English? Thank you.
I mean, let's say there's a lot of parts to that question. Yeah, I think it is actually one of the most, if I was a media reporter, definitely like the story I would want to write is about this competition that, you know, we feel very intensely, certainly as we are very ambitious in Brazil, in Mexico, in France and Germany, and the UK. And I think different companies think of it quite differently. I had a really interesting discussion with Stephen Adler, the editor-in-chief of Reuters, who talks about sort of asking his journalists to, in some sense, suspend their citizenship so that they can, you know, report neutrally from anywhere in the Reuters voice, or in sort of from a global perspective. And I think we approach it in an opposite way. Like, we kind of radically assimilate to the countries we're in, and you know, and sort of expect our journalists to be patriots of the countries they're in some sense. And also have found just really incredibly exciting collaborations between, you know, the Japanese market that's really interested in feature changes on Twitter and our Silicon Valley bureau, for instance. In terms of deciding which markets to go into, I mean, I think we're at a point where not all, but there are established big media markets where there's basically markets where the media business is much more developed, and those are the ones where we've started, and markets where there's news that's of constant global interest. And so, but I think if anybody's got sort of an algorithm to tell me where we ought to go next, I'm interested.
Hi, I'm Matt Wells from CNN. I'm Matt Wells from CNN.
Oh my God, you're Matt Wells.
Hi.
Hi.
How's it going?
So you're Matt Wells from Janine Gibson's Instagram?
Yeah, that too. You said you were describing how deeply embedded you are in the social scene, and that means that you're very beholden to social platforms. You said that you've kind of built out a platform of your own retrospectively. You're still, however, very, very deeply embedded in social. Is that a comfortable place to be? If Facebook went down tomorrow, you'd go down with them?
I mean, it's never comfortable, right? Like things are just changing so fast. So I'm not sure comfort is really what anybody is going to get out of this moment. I mean, I think we do try to distinguish between the platforms and their audiences. Like there are moments and have been moments on Facebook when there were things that kind of worked technically on Facebook. Curiosity Gap headlines were one, but they were obviously kind of spammy, and you could tell kind of qualitatively people hated them. And I think we always try to keep an eye on what is getting authentic engagement, what are the metrics for authentic engagement, which is maybe sharing rather than traffic, because you want to, I think, their audiences, the people aren't going to go away, and I think we try very hard to stay aligned with where the actual audience is rather than the platform mechanics. And these platforms are very good at aligning their mechanics with the audience, and they're usually in sync, but when you see some hack that's sort of allowing you to exploit a technical feature of the platform against the audience, I think that's often a very dangerous place to go. Got probably time for one more question.
Just wanted to go back to the Christopher Steele memo point. And I think a lot of us here can understand the argument you've made. This was a major document. It was being discussed at the highest levels. There was a case for putting it out there. But I'm interested to know how far, given what you also said about the public having a right to know things and secret cabals of media knowing stuff that the public doesn't know, how far you are comfortable going with the defense that says, we're publishing this, we don't know if it's true, but here you are.
I mean, I think it's obviously case by case, and that this was a case that had quite strong arguments on both sides, right? I mean, we probably all get tips in our email boxes making outrageous claims that have no consequence. You know, there's no reason that we don't print, and I'm not making an argument for that. I mean, I think that I think for me a big question is, are people acting based on it? You know, members of the U.S. government, people at the FBI and senior U.S. senators were taking specific action based on it, and it was impossible to understand what they were doing without it. And to me, that was a pretty crucial part of why you publish it. Yeah, I think it's a spectrum, right? And we're definitely not at the most radical end, which I think maybe was more fashionable 10 years ago, but of just that you have an obligation to publish every word. We're probably further on that side of the spectrum, but I think it's obviously a spectrum.
Ben Smith, editor-in-chief for BuzzFeed. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And then want to ask you about Thanks so much for that. Okay, we just want to remind you one more time that we have the Speed Geeking. That's the news